Good afternoon. Welcome to the first Communication Research Center Colloquium of the Fall 2025 semester. My name is Michelle Amazine. I'm the Associate Dean for the College of Communication. I am also the Director of the Communication Research Center. I'm thrilled to see so many faces here. Before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping items. We are recording this event, so I please ask you to silence any phones, laptops, anything that dings or beeps, so it doesn't interfere with our recording. I would also like to take this opportunity to remind any students who are trying to get credits, research participation credits through SONA, to be sure that you have checked in with our staff who's in the back of the room. They'll need to swipe your ID for that. And speaking of our staff, I do want to thank Amanda King, who is running around somewhere. Amanda, thank you. Amanda is our lab and research manager of the CRC. And one of our graduate assistants is here with us today. Yoon Hee is back there. And then we also have Ming Yu and Ramona, who could not be with us today, but this colloquium would not be possible without any of them. So my thanks go to them. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Michael Elasmar. He is an associate professor in the Department of Mass Communication, Advertising, and Public Relations in the College of Communication. He holds a Ph.D. from Michigan State University. He was the director of the CRC from 1994 to 2015. And in 1997, he launched the Marketing Communication Research Program in our department that some of you are enrolled in right now. And I had this beautiful introduction written out for Dr. Elasmar, but alas, it is sitting on my desk, so I cannot speak to all those interesting nuggets that I found. But I can say that he's going to be talking to us today about a chapter from his new book. He'll tell you what the title of his book is. It's from DeGrooter. And the talk of his lecture today is an AI-assisted methodology for quantifying measurement error of social media text posts. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Elasmar.
All right. Well, we have a mixed crowd in here in the sense that we have undergraduates, we have graduates, and we have faculty. And I am going to be essentially trying to explain all the bits and pieces that go into this particular methodology in the simplest way possible. There are some aspects of the methodology that obviously you'd have to take a class on in order to understand what that particular chunk of it does. But I'll try to explain it in the most plain, basically, words that I can. Welcome, and thank you all for coming. Let me tell you a little bit about the big picture. So when we're talking about fancy terms like quantifying measurement error of social media text posts, this resides within a very large picture. And the picture is this. All of you are in the College of Communication, and all of you are basically here because you're interested in audiences. You're interested in users. You're interested in informing users, persuading users. You're interested in changing some aspects of a user's thoughts about a particular product or a particular brand or a particular candidate if you're into political communication or a particular institution, right? And so if I want to think about what the big picture is within which this particular presentation resides, it would be a word that we don't normally use in class, but we should be using more often, which is we're in the business of modifying the invisible. Think about this. We're all in the business of trying to understand the invisible and modify the invisible. You might say, what invisible? Think about it for a second. Do you know what the users are thinking? Can you see what the users are thinking? Do you want to modify what the users are thinking? Yes, all of this is within the realm of the invisible. So if I want to talk about the larger context in which this takes place, okay, come on, where are you? What? See, that's amazing what I was talking about. I don't mess with it. Okay, so, can be next. Okay, so the big picture essentially is why every comm major needs to understand the invisible. Needs to understand what's happening in the shared thought processes or in the shared thinking that exists within users or within target audiences. Without understanding that, you really don't know how to get through in whatever aims you have for your messaging. So, what the heck is the invisible? I have a little diagram that I can show you. And there's a difference between behavior and the invisible. Because the behavior, we can see. We can, for example, we can monitor somebody clicking. We can basically see if a person made a purchase, right? We can see that. That's something that we can capture. But what we cannot see is what led them to engage in that behavior. So the difference between behavior and basically the invisible is this. Take a look at this. This is a very simplistic example of people looking at a tree. We can see them looking at a tree, right? We can see their behavior. What is it that we can't see? What's the invisible? Why? What's going on? Yep. Well, specifically what aspect of the tree are they looking at, or whether even they're looking at the tree, or they're simply kind of rehearsing some thoughts that the tree has inspired them to rehearse. So the invisible would be something like this, right? So the invisible would be something like this. Notice the difference between being able to see the invisible, and now all of a sudden, now I have to say, the invisible is fairly complex in the sense that it's not usually one thing, but it's an interrelationship among many, many, many building blocks. And those interrelationships are going to be what's going to give you insights into how to get through your particular target audiences. But let me actually keep it simple now. So if we're looking at this and we're saying, all right, so they're not all the same. Their motivation for looking at the tree are not all the same. In fact, what they're thinking about is not all the same. But being able to start identifying building blocks of the invisible all of a sudden allows us to start basically sorting people out into people who are similar along the invisible. So all of a sudden you can start saying, okay, well, all these people, everybody's different, but you know what, this person, that person can be their own segment. So you can start essentially thinking in terms of segmentation, in terms of people who are more homogeneous along the invisible, right? So we got out the idea of the invisible. And let me kind of relate this to the big picture of what the presentation is trying to do. At the end of this presentation, so in the next hour, by the end of it, I would have gotten to the point of trying to get the invisible out of social media texts. Okay, so this is where we're headed, but there's a long way to get there. We have a good time, okay? A good 45 minutes before I get there. All right, so what's the research question what's the objective? The RQ here is, can we somehow extract the invisible from social media text, obviously that is not bot generated, because we're not interested in bots, and be confident we did so without a large amount of error. And somehow tell you that we can quantify how much error. I mean, if we can do that, that would be fantastic, because that's never been done before. Okay, so in the context of social media text, it's never been done before. So how are we going to get there? We're going to get there by basically bringing together multiple areas of science, specifically 4 of them. So if you want to think about how this methodology, right, which I'm going to talk about, came together. It came together as a function of something that's been going on for decades, what we know from social cognition theory, or social cognition theory, and what we know from psychometrics, all of which are very fancy terms, but I'll try to explain each one of them in very simple ways that you can relate to, okay, I promise you. And what we know from natural language processing and how that's evolved, and what we know from the recent arrival of artificial intelligence, or AI, in the past 3 years. Okay? So So let me start talking about, very quickly, about, well, not very quickly, but let me start talking anyway, about social cognition theory. So this is an entire research program that has led us to understand how humans come to acquire knowledge that is assembled within their brain and that is retrieved when they're trying to understand something that pertains to this knowledge or that relates to this knowledge. An example of that would be essentially if I tell you, for example, can you come over? I'm doing a get together for the 4th of July. In order for you to answer that question, you have to know what the 4th of July is. So now I know that if you were born in this country, then what happened is all of a sudden, and even if you're not born, all of us do this, but those who are born in this country will have certain basically connections that are probably a little bit different than those who are not. But all of us did the following within a fraction of a second. We retrieved from memory all those things that convey the meaning of what the 4th of July is. It could be the smell of barbecue, the sound of fireworks, the scenery of basically summer scenery, right? It could be many things. It could be a taste, it could be a sound, it could be a sight, it could be a smell, all of which will retrieve from memory within a fraction of a second, each one of which is a building block of what the 4th of July means in your brain. You okay with that? So essentially what social cognition theory has done for us is has given us a lot of understanding that humans come to understand the world around them from the moment they're born till they become however old they are by assembling information and storing it inside their memories, and this information is interconnected, and that interconnection is actually retrieved from memory when you're actually facing a situation that you're trying to understand, and that information helps you understand it. Okay, so very basic information. There's something else that it gives us. So if you want to look at my basically interpretation of social cognition theory, it gives us a couple of things. One, if we're trying to understand a behavior, then that behavior is going to actually be a function of our inference, our understanding of the behavior. If we're trying to engage in a behavior, if we're about to engage in a behavior, then our engagement in this behavior is going to be a function of our understanding of what this behavior is, or what the concept that's related to that behavior is. That concept, the inference about the concept, is a function of the interrelated network of knowledge that we have acquired since we were born, and that relates to that concept. So this idea of, they call it, within social cognition theory, they call it schemas, right? So it doesn't matter what they call them, I'm telling you, it's an interrelated network of building blocks that all together convey the meaning that we understand when we're faced with that concept, right? So that gives us this idea. And then of course, if you want to go backwards, you can go backwards. That came from information that we acquired about the concept that we're trying to basically react to, and that information came from sensory, basically data, from what people told us, what we watched on the media, from what friends told us, from what leaders told us, whoever are your agents of socialization. So, let me give you an example of that. Here's a person trying to make a decision about a purchase, and it's an article of clothing. So what that person will do, for those of you who are in advertising or in marketing, what they'll do is they'll actually kind of basically, without making any effort, all of a sudden, before making that decision, they're going to retrieve from memory a schema that exists within their brain that pertains to that particular brand or to that particular article of clothing, right? So just so kind of you understand, it's an interrelated network of building blocks. I want you to remember this because what I'm going to try to tell you is, with the context of social media in a bit, is how do we extract building blocks from social media? And how do we know that they are building blocks? So now we're talking in general. So social cognition theory essentially introduces the idea that there are building blocks, these building blocks are interconnected, and those interconnections, if we understand them, and if we understand them across users, not for one person, but if we understand the shared interconnections and the shared building blocks that exist among a group of users, then we have insights like you can never get in any other way. Okay? So that's what social cognition gives us. So that's area of science number one. So, what are some of these building blocks? Some of the building blocks that make up the schemas, some of the most common building blocks, are going to be beliefs. All of us acquire beliefs, and I'm not talking about religious beliefs. I'm talking about brand beliefs. I'm talking about technology beliefs. I'm talking about anything that essentially you think about. You don't feel, because feeling is a different thing. So building blocks include beliefs. Building blocks also include attitudes and emotion. Attitude is a predisposition, right? The difference between a belief and an attitude, say for example with respect to the Bahamas, would be the islands of the Bahamas have many sunny beaches. There's no emotion in that. It's simply cognition. Fact in your head. Subjective fact, it has many sunny beaches. The difference between that and an attitude would be, I would love to go to the beaches of the Bahamas. That's a predisposition, a positive predisposition to going to the Bahamas, to go basically to the beaches. The contrast to that would be emotion. I am so upset that I got to the Bahamas and they mistreated me at the airport. That is an emotion. And of course, then you have intention. I plan to go to the Bahamas, to the beaches, right? And we have past behavior. I've been to the Bahamas. I can talk about my experience having gone to the Bahamas. So these are going to be some of the most common building blocks that go into the schemas for anything and everything that we act upon. That's important to know because you want to keep that in mind when we get to the point of how does that relate to social media. Okay, so this is what essentially the pieces of the puzzle that these represent, and I've already said them and I'm going to talk about them again, which is social cognition tells us, look, we have building blocks. These building blocks are interrelated, and these building blocks include beliefs, attitudes, emotion, intentions, and past behavior. So this is what this particular piece of the puzzle gives us, right? So now let's continue. So we have essentially one source of science. Another source of science is psychometrics. Now that sounds like a fancy term, and it is a fancy term, but I'm going to explain it to you in the most common, in the most basic words. And I'm going to let you actually relate to it in a second. So, and then if you really want to understand psychometrics, I teach a whole graduate class on essentially using psychometrics, a whole system for actually quantifying and doing all sorts of shenanigans by basically doing psychometrics, or at least applications of psychometrics. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about psychometrics. Essentially is the formalization of intuitive thinking. It's formalization and actually heavy quantification of intuitive thinking. How so, you might say? All right, let me explain. So, how do you intuitively reach conclusions about the invisible aspects of others? Think about it for a minute. Let me actually give you a context, so that everybody thinks about the same context. Is a classmate attracted to you? How about that? Everybody can relate to that? Because at some point or another, you probably wondered. Okay. So what do? Can you see whether they're attracted to you? Can you look inside their head? No. So what are you going to look at? You're going to basically pick up on signs, right? We all intuitively pick up on signs. Well, signs, the more basically formal term is going to be, we're going to look for indicators. Okay, indicators like what? For example, your eyes meet and you see them smiling at you. Does that mean they like you, or does that mean they simply are having a good day? Could be either, right? Or they're simply friendly people, right? Could be either, right? And by itself, as an indicator, is not going to be sufficient. But then, ask whether they can occupy an empty seat next to you. Well, the class is crowded. Maybe they're simply asking because the class is crowded, right? Maybe you just happen that they're asking to sit next to you. Says they love the outfit you're wearing. It could be that they like to compliment people, right? Ask to study together and ask for your number. Oh, maybe they like to study and they want to study with. But if you look at all four indicators as a set, then the chances are that these are occurring by pure random coincidence, or pure luck is unlikely. So when you're looking at indicators, you're saying, what do these all indicators have in common? It could be that they're all happening randomly, but the probability of them happening randomly is fairly low. It's probably that there's something going on there. This person is probably attracted to you. It's not 100% certain, but all these indicators, if in fact the invisible is this person attracted to me, then that invisible is going to be driving each one of these. It's going to be driving why the person does what the person does. So the notion of multiple indicators for every building block of the invisible is what psychometrics gives us. It tells us, look, if you have multiple indicators, all of which are pertaining to the same, and all of which are pertaining to the same invisible, then you can engage in all sorts of quantitative modeling in order to determine how strong each indicator is driven by the invisible. And by doing that, you can quantify the amount of error that you are making in essentially assuming that you have captured the invisible. You with me on this? So psychometrics, summarizing essentially decades and decades of science on that, tells us if you have, and only if you have multiple indicators. If you don't have multiple indicators, you can't do any of this. But if you have multiple indicators, then you can quantify the relationship between the invisible and each indicator, and you can also estimate the amount of error that you're making in essentially saying that you have put your finger on an invisible building block. So a visual representation of that looks something like this. Okay, so the notion of multiple indicators, so the invisible and entire quantitative approach, I've already talked about that, and so the piece of puzzle possible through this is essentially is that if we have multiple indicators, then there might be hope in us being able to get to the invisible. Are you seeing where this is going? So when we get to social media, text, we're going to say, how do we get multiple indicators from within text? Okay, this is coming up, all right? So the representation of that normally looks like something like this. So this is actually the visual representation of measurement modeling. So with measurement modeling, what you have is you have the invisible, which is usually called a hidden concept or a true score, depending on how the training was. Then what you're essentially saying, this is what I want to basically be able to put my finger on. I'm not certain if I'm able to put a finger on it because I can't see it directly. But what I have is I have indicators for it. And as long as these indicators fit certain criteria, what criteria I'll have to take a class meeting to determine, as long as these indicators fit a certain criteria, then what we can do is we can, if we have these indicators and we have a large sample of people that basically we've gathered these indicators from, what we can do is we can quantify validity and we can quantify reliability. The arrows represent the arrows represent the relationship between the invisible and each indicator and the and the errors and each indicator. And by doing that, you would have quantified validity and reliability within the context of measurement. Not within the context of experimentation, within the context of measurement. Only if we have that. So what psychometrics tells us essentially is, if we're going to be looking for invisible in social media text, invisible building blocks, right? Building blocks, beliefs, attitudes, whatever, okay? Then what we need to do is we need to somehow end up with multiple indicators. Right? You with me on this? So now the question is, how do we do that? And I will try to explain to you when we get to it. The third area of science that we bring to the table, and that kind of contributes to all of this, is the fact that now all of a sudden, and this happened, I'm not certain, maybe 25 years ago it began as a very, very basic area of science, which is to say the following. There's a lot of social media, basically chatter going on. And initially people said, all right, so how can we analyze this text? So text analysis, right? And they said, well, at the start they said, well, I mean, we have machines, and we can train machines to read text and tell us what this text is saying based on what we're training the machine to look for. And that was machine learning, right? And that was machine learning. So let me actually click on that. And that was machine learning. With machine learning, you had to actually, you yourself sit down and try to basically code text by saying, okay, this particular sentence is positive, this particular sentence is negative, this particular sentence is very negative, this particular sentence is very positive, and then you tell the machine, look, here's what I've given you, now I want you to basically code the rest of the text following the patterns that I've used. And I can tell you honestly, we had great hope for it to actually do anything, and honestly, in my experience, machine learning for the vast majority, for the most effort that was actually ever done in it, was still not very good. Meaning, sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. It was very, very unreliable in coding text. Now, coding and quantifying text, we need to assign numeral to text. Say on a scale of -9 to +9, how positive is this particular sentence? Its ability to do that was not very good until it evolved into natural language processing. So the idea when we had training models that didn't work very well, when NLP came about, it was a breakthrough. It was a breakthrough, and it still is a breakthrough. And so what does NLP do? What does it do? What NLP does, essentially, is it codes the text based on an enormous database that has been pre-trained. And it's essentially kind of AI in the sense that it was the AI that preceded AI, in the sense that the amount of information that they had when reading text and that they could access was much larger than any information that a researcher could provide the machine by training the machine. So the machine essentially came pre-trained. And the training was very, very good. Now, why am I saying this? Because now NLP is going to be integrated into AI. AI is the last part. NLP is going to be integrated into AI, meaning now, it used to be that you'd have to do NLP separately. Nowadays, you can tell ChatGPT, I want you to do NLP for me. And I want you to analyze this text. And I'm going to give you an example of that. So just coming up next, just bear with me. So what does NLP bring to the table? What NLP brings to the table is the fact that we have had a way of quantifying the sentiment present within text that is actually pretty darn good. I would say excellent. So we're at the point where we can quantify the sentiment within text. Now, why is it important to quantify the sentiment? Because remember, if we're going to end up with multiple indicators, with each indicator being social media text, then the only way we can do math on these things is if we can somehow quantify the text, the building block. You see, without being able to quantify the building block, we can't use psychometrics. You see how, so all of these pieces come together, right? And the last piece is going to be the one that broke through just about every barrier, and I'll tell you why. I started working on this program in 2014, the research program that actually, finally I'm talking about actually being able to show you something that's tangible, that brings all these parts together, because the missing piece was AI. I got to the point where I could do essentially NLP, I could quantify the text, but one of the biggest problems that I had is the building blocks that I was trying to quantify could not be automatically separated by the machines. You see where this is going? So for example, a person might write a product review, which I'll show you in a second as an example of. The product review might be many building blocks of their thoughts, not one. A lot of people think it's one. I'll show you it's not. I want to demonstrate to you that it's not one. It's not one. So what I needed to do, and I did that beginning in 2014, is I would get my friendly grad assistants to sit down and actually try to divide the text up so we could actually chunk it out and analyze each part of it using NLP. You know how time consuming that is? And you know how limited that is? Because the grad student can only do maybe 5,000, which is nothing in terms of the scale of doing these kinds of analyses. So when AI came about, and this is where big breakthrough, AI was able to do something that's never ever been done before in human civilization, specifically for researchers who are interested in analyzing text, which is, you can tell AI, look, I need you to read this text, and I need you to pull out of this text the following types of expressions. I would like you to pull out beliefs, which I define as a person's thinking about a topic. I'd like you to pull out attitudes, which are basically a person's predispositions about that topic. And then all the other building blocks that I talked about, as long as you define them, you give them prompts, right? And so it's able to pull it out. And then you can tell them, okay, now that you pulled it out, I'd like you to score each one on a -9 to +9. And you might say, why, that's an excellent scale for actually doing this with machines. And what it will do, and I will demonstrate to you, it will do it. It will do it. And it will do it in ways that are actually mind-boggling, right? So now, notice, so we have 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts, and now we assemble in the 5th part in a second. But let me actually show you this real quick. So, the idea of the AI assistant overcomes the limitation of traditional text analysis. It emulates human reading of media text. I had the AI do it. I read it, and even though it's not perfect, in 2020, in the summer of 2024, now we're a year later, right? So if I were to do it, and now things have evolved a lot. But in the summer of 2024, when I did this, it was pretty darn good. I would say about 75 to 80%. The reading of the AI is exactly how I would have read it. Which means what? It's not perfect yet, but I would assume that by a year later, it's actually improved quite a bit. And I was ready to do it now, but I think we don't have access to brainwash. Anyways, that's a totally different story, okay? But essentially, what we can do with AI is we can automate and we can scale. We can automate, meaning we can tell it to actually pull the building blocks from text and quantify each. And I'll demonstrate to you what I mean by that. So with AI also, you can pinpoint and separate the thought process building blocks, as I said earlier. So the example of the store review, I said I'm going to give you an example of a store review. Here is a store review. I don't know if you can read the whole thing, but here's what it looks like. That's an example. This is one person. This is a review of a store. Normally what people do, what do? Anybody knows? Normally without using the system that I'm talking about. They say, give me a sentiment for what this person feels about the store, and they get one sentiment. In this particular case, it will be negative. What are they missing on? What are they missing out on by doing that? What are they missing out on? The building blocks. This is not a single building block. How many building blocks are in here? Remember, I mean, if this is a human being that's expressing their thoughts, then their thoughts are reflecting many, many building blocks related to the store. Not one. But traditionally, the text has been considered as a single building block. Now that we know, based on social cognition theory, that actually it's many, many blocks, we can expect to find many, many different blocks, then if I were to tell AI, which I did, okay, to go ahead and basically pull beliefs, attitudes, intentions, emotions, and past behaviors from this, and quantify each, how many would it be able to get out? Anybody wants to guess before I show you? How many building blocks are in here? Each of which is distinct from the other building block. Anybody wants to take a guess? Take a guess.
20.
Very close. Anybody else? I said very close, and then somebody said 19. 19 is the way to go. Okay, let me show you real quick, okay? Let me show you. So here's what it is. So each sentence, notice how this is AI, this is not my writing, okay? So AI says, I hate this department store more and more each time I go here. It says emotion, and it's a negative 0.80. Remember, it goes from negative 0.9 to a positive 0.9, with negatives being negative sentiment. The closer to a negative 0.9 it is, the more negative, the more extremely negative. And it tells me the use of hate and the negative tone suggests a strong negative sentiment. This is AI, it's not me. It's reading. It is reading. And it's quantifying. And that's a beautiful thing, because you'll see what I'll do with them. What do you think I'm going to do with them? Well, you'll see. Okay. All right, so this is just an example of basically how you can take one text and actually try to look for building blocks, right? So some of these are behaviors, past behaviors, some of these are beliefs, some of these are emotions, and some of these are going to be attitudes. right? So there are many, many building blocks, but if we were to consider this whole text as one thing, which is what most people do, and get a single score, then we have a jambalaya that we don't know what that single score is actually pertaining to. We don't know what building block it pertains to. Whereas if we split it up, we have all the building blocks and we can actually pinpoint each building block, what it is and what its score is. Okay? All right. Okay. Let me continue. So these are 19. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the AI assist methodology. So bringing these 4 areas of science together, here's what we do. Proof of concept. Search was conducted to locate a topic that's been the focus of intense debate on social media. We did the same thing this time for another topic, which I won't talk about until you actually get the data. The topic chosen at the time was TikTok ban, proposed by the US government in 2024. A search for TikTok ban on X via Brandwatch and covering the time from January through May of 2024 took place. And we found 53,806 tweets. We removed the retweets. Don't ask me why we do that. It's very important to do because otherwise you have duplicated data, which actually will mess up with your math like you would not believe. Okay, removing retweets, ChatGPT was used to break down the content of each social media post into the type of expression. By type expression, I mean the type of building block, like belief, attitude. Okay, so I'm using type of expression here to kind of basically, rather than simply using building block. It's the same thing. So, into the type of expression typically present in public opinion studies, beliefs, attitudes, emotions, intentions, and behaviors. Okay? After identifying the types of expression present in each, the ChatGPT was then used to identify the specific objects. See, in the product review, we didn't put the object. Here we're putting the object. What is the object? It could be, the object is, what is this belief about? What specific angle of the general topic is this belief about? Give me examples of that. An object in this context is the main subject of the expression. For example, US Congress, President Biden, but even within that, it could be US Congress policy about X, which is different than US Congress about policy about Y. See, now we're getting very refined. So not only do we have an expression type, but we have an expression type that pertains to a specific object, which makes a very specific building block, which is distinct from the same expression type about a different object, each one of which is its own separate building block. You know, now we're getting more and more sensitive, right? Now, why do we want that level of specificity? Can you see where this is going? You start thinking psychometrics. If you use each one of these as an indicator, you want indicators about the same thing. All right, I'll show you how we did that. All right, so after coding all combinations of expression types by objects, the data was then reorganized. This is another shift. Was reorganized because we're not interested in the text, are we? What are you guys interested in? Why are you in communication? Are you interested in the text? No, you're interested in the person saying the text. You're interested in the invisible, and that invisible is within the brain, not of the text. The brain of whom? Your users, your target audiences, right? So what we did is we actually identified a user ID, and we flipped the entire data so that the actual data set became by user. So now we have by user building blocks. Is that crazy or what? Building blocks for the users. Okay. So then what we did, that was done by matching tweet authors by using their Twitter identification number. All right. We focused on highly active authors. Why do we focus on highly active authors? What do you think? You need multiple indicators from each person. A person cannot say one thing and then that's it, because you only have a single indicator. And we talked about the fact that with a single indicator, we can't do math. We don't know what we're looking at. Just like the case is the person interested in, or is the person potentially attracted to you? Well, they just kind of looked at you and smiled. The single indicator could be, they're just having a good day. It has nothing to do with you, right? But when you have multiple indicators, then it gets more interesting. Because then you're actually saying, well, could these be underlying the same invisible? And there are mathematical modeling techniques that you can use to test that. Okay? But without multiple indicators, you cannot do that. So we asked ChatGPT to compute the sentiment score present within each combination, within each building block, from a -9 to a -0.9 to a positive 0.9. It's not negative, right? It's 0.9. The results in pairs of expressions by object combination scores for each highly active author. So essentially, when we looked at people, we said, look, we're going to look at people who actually have said the same thing or the same, have expressed the same, have used the same expression type by same object more than once. That way we end up with multiple indicators. To my chagrin, we didn't find too many, because the data set was not that large, we didn't find too many that exceeded 2. I'd like to have 4 indicators, because with 4 indicators, then the mathematical modeling that goes into measurement movement becomes very, very powerful. With 2, it's like we're barely scratching the surface. What we found essentially is 2 for the vast majority. And then, of course, now I get into the fancy terms. So now that we had 2 indicators per individual, what I could do at a very low level, because I needed 4 to do it at a high level, I could do something called essentially a confirmation of whether or not these 2 indicators could be underlying a same invisible building block. That's called confirmatory factor. And not only that, but you can also do essentially reliability. If you remember from the, you probably don't remember from the diagram, but I'll show it to you again in a diagram that's specifically related to what we did. But I'm going to try to basically tell you a little caricature here. So if this is the invisible, and these 2 are the indicators, so the confirmatory factor analysis is telling us how strong is the relationship between that invisible and each of the indicators. And reliability is telling us how much error, random error, is actually being introduced by your model. How much error you're making in saying that these 2 are essentially capturing the same invisible. Okay? If you want to learn about these things, I teach a grad class on how to do it. And I also have a totally simplistic and comprehensive system for doing it. So I don't like, it's my system. So I show you how to use it. Okay? So usable, very usable. Results. We found 239 authors who expressed themselves 2 or more times about the same expression type by object combination. When we focused on these 239 authors, we found there were 55 unique combinations of expression type by object for authors who expressed themselves 2 or more times about the same combination. Here's what we found. Essentially, these are all, I think these were for combinations that exceeded 10, because obviously there were some with 1s, a lot with 1s, but the one that received the highest is going to be the belief about government basically motivations for banning TikTok. And so we said, all right, so this is the highest one. That's where we're going to find basically, this is our best opportunity to do a data analysis on that. So we picked on that. We basically focused on that. So since belief about TikTok ban has the highest frequency, we decided to exclusively focus on this specific expression by object combination. There were 97 authors who expressed themselves twice about the topic, and 25 authors who expressed themselves more than twice. Right? Our data set's fairly small. When combining all expression types that were 2 or more and that we had semantically verified, so what we did is we didn't say we're going to trust ChatGPT, we're going to say, all right, ChatGPT, give me these things that you think are the same. Give me these things that you think are basically indicators of the same invisible. And then we read them, and some of them we said, absolutely not, these are not. Right? So this is where ChatGPT was not doing a 100% accuracy job, but it was doing a good 80 to 85%, which wasn't too bad. Okay? So I'm assuming that a year later things have gotten better because, the thing has been trained more, right? So we ended up with 48 pairs of expression by object about beliefs about TikTok ban. We computed 0-order correlations. If that doesn't mean anything to you, don't let it mean anything to you. Essentially it's saying, look, as the score of one of the indicators goes up, does the other one go up? In by itself, it doesn't tell you anything. But it's a good sign if it's not there, then it means that there's no way that these 2 could be actually indicators in the same invisible. But it's there, it's a good sign, okay, we're on our way. We could actually see it. So we found a sizable positive association indicating the sentiments in each pair of indicators were generally pointing in the same direction, and that's exactly what you can expect to find when looking at 2 indicators in the same construct, but this is not a test of it. The test of it is coming up. Given we had checked the semantic content on each pair of indicators and the correlation was positive and sizable, we then explored whether the data can be tested for validity and reliability. And we did that. However, because we had 2 indicators, obviously there are mathematical limitations to it, but hey, it's better than not, okay? So the single indicator that we could test, the single factor that we could test for Normally, you also need multiple factors for this to work. Not only multiple indicators, but you also need multiple factors. But nevertheless, we had the data that we had, but the data demonstrates something very, very powerful. We explained 81% of variance in the data, the very fact that we had a single invisible. Essentially it says, look, if you consider these pairs of indicators as essentially telling you something about the invisible that exists within the brain of the persons who actually were expressing themselves through social media text, we're explaining 81% of the variance in fact, in the data, and the factor loadings were 0.90, and Cronbach's alpha was 0.77. Let me show you the diagram real quick. So if you remember the diagram that I showed you earlier, so this is conceptually, and this is the actual results, right? So conceptually, if you have one building block that's invisible, and you have two indicators, which is not ideal, I tell you it's not ideal. I'd like to have four, because mathematically, the mathematics are going to work a lot better. It's going to be a lot more precise, right? But nevertheless, we know that there's going to be a test for the relationship between the invisible and each indicator, and a test of the relationship between random error and the indicators. And if you look at that, this is beautiful. This is unbelievable, actually. When you think about it, I mean, if I get results like that from studies of surveys and stuff like that, I'd be jumping up and down in joy. This is the kind of stuff that, so we've got the invisible. The invisible is driving the first indicator on a 0.90 out of 1, driving the second indicator the same way, and the random error is essentially 1 minus 0.77, which is very, very small relative to what we usually get. And I got news for you. It might sound pretentious, but this is the first time that anyone has actually quantified measurement error in the context of extracting building blocks from social media text. And you get to see it. And if you want to know more about it, read my book, which is, okay. So anyway, conclusion. By first subjecting the two indicators of beliefs about TikTok ban to factor analysis, we found that the results support the notion that both indicators underlie a common latent variable, which is the invisible. And then next, when we tested the indicators for reliability, we found a large convex alpha. Both outcomes are quantification of measurement error in social media text. To the best of my knowledge, this is the first demonstration that it's possible to quantify systematic coming from on top and random coming from the bottom, measurement error associated with information extracted from social media text. So assessment in 2024, ChatGPT was pretty good at identifying expression type. As long as we told it how we define these expression types, we actually prompted the expression types, and was very, very good, really, really, really good at scoring these using the built-in NLP, basically algorithms that they have. But it had a high rate of not limiting itself to a single object for each expression combination despite our instructions, so we had to step in there and we had to kind of separate objects. This means that we will still need it manually to check for errors and split expression type by object combinations to arrive at a single object. In 2024, ChatGPT could not deal with objects spelled slightly differently and considered them separate despite our instructions to count them as the same. I have a feeling they probably fixed that by now. It's a year later. There's ChatGPT 5. We were using ChatGPT 3.5 for this. We attempted to have ChatGPT resolve spelling differences, but the results were unsatisfactory. So which means that you still have the need for human intervention. This is not going to be doing things without you being there and checking every single step and saying, did it do what I asked it to do? Can I verify? Can I check it, right? There were frequent discrepancies between the ChatGPT reading of semantics, meaning what does this sentence mean within two expression by object combinations deemed to be the same. In our reading of semantics, it's about an 85% accuracy between our reading and the machine. And had we not manually checked on these, so this is a warning for all of you who are going to do it blindly because you're going to end up with garbage. Had we manually not checked on these, then pairs of expression type by object would have been combined even though they didn't share much of a semantic similarity. And that would have affected what? That would have affected essentially the testing of the quantification of the errors coming from on top, because then it would just simply reduce the influence of the invisible onto each one of them. Okay, last but not least, limitations. The methodology works only if individual identifiers are available to match two or more social media expressions to the same individual. But even if an identifier is not available, because that's not always the case, like if you look, for example, for discussions on Reddit, right? If you can download discussions from Reddit, there's no identifier for the most part. So, but even if an identifier is not available, and the entire methodology that I'm talking about is not feasible, it would still be incredibly beneficial for researchers analyzing social media text to break these up by distinct expression by objects rather than lumping them all together and getting a single score, okay? All right, the sample of expression type by objects need to be enormous for this methodology to yield indicators for more than one construct. So ideally, this is very important because, as I was telling you earlier, I was hoping for two things. I was hoping that if Johnny said, I like pizza, I enjoy pizza, which is not what the context I'm talking about, just to kind of basically tell you though, if Johnny said, I like pizza and I enjoy pizza on two separate occasions, and I'm using these two indicators as Johnny's feelings about pizza, I'm hoping that also Johnny talked about, I enjoy the beach and I like the beach, because now all of a sudden I have Johnny's invisibles on two different things. The more I have invisibles from the same, and the more these invisibles from the same are repeated across individuals, the more the mathematics work for the entire analysis that I did. So it's essentially, and in order for you to do this, you have to scale it. You have to scale it, meaning instead of beginning with 54,000 tweets, you got to begin with 10 million tweets, right? And that's going to be an issue, because then how are you going to download them, and how are you going to process them, and who's going to pay for them in our case, right? And then you can go from there. But if you do that, then the probability of the same person having expressed themselves about different invisibles multiple times increases only if you scale it at a very, very, very high level. And essentially, so with more than a single construct, we test for unidimensionality and all sorts of other things, which we weren't able to do either. Okay, so it's very useful to transform the corpus of social media expressions into components of thought processes consisting of beliefs, attitudes, emotions, intentions, and behaviors. And the importance of scaling, which I talked about. With multiple building blocks, the arrival at a thought process related to specific topics becomes more possible. So let me tell you what that means. If I began by saying that we need to understand the interrelationships among the building blocks. In order for you to be able to understand the interrelationships among building blocks, each building block would have to be confirmed as essentially reflecting the invisible, and you really need to have multiple building blocks in order for you to have the interrelationships. So the whole thing needs to be scaled up. The whole thing needs to be scaled up, okay? All right, so, and if you want to see what the diagram is that I came up with, which I don't know if you can read any of it, but essentially this is a mindset that you need to adopt. And this is in the book, so you know, it's in the book, and actually there's a lot more explanation in the book, in chapter 10 of the book. And I have multiple more diagrams for other things in the book as well. I like diagrams because they kind of convey how I see things. Okay. A mindset for quantifying measurement error when extracting an opinion from social media text. And it begins, obviously, it's the whole process that we followed, but it's more like a flow chart, so you can actually kind of use it as a guide when you're doing your own work. And that's pretty much it. Thank you for your attention. Yes, absolutely.
All right. So we have time for some questions.
And that's how the four areas of science come together, essentially. This is how the knowledge that we got from all four, when you integrate it, it ends up with this particular methodology. Yeah.
So while folks are thinking of a question, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll come to you with a microphone. But let me ask you, could this be applied beyond social media? Like, can you apply it to news articles or letters to the editor?
As long as you're still focusing on the fact that this text was generated by one individual and you can track that individual across multiple texts.
Yeah,
so this is
like
where
a journalist.
The whole methodology, yeah, certainly, you can, I mean, as long as the journalist is engaging in opinion and not simply reporting.
Okay.
Because then the reporting is not necessarily reflecting your own thought process. So you want the content to reflect somebody's thought process.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yes. Question over here.
Hi, thank you for the great presentation. I have a particular question about why the unit of analysis has to be individual. Because in computational test analysis has been like semantic analysis for descriptive of what people are thinking, believing, attitude, like emotion as well. Why the unit of analysis has to be individual?
Without having the individual, let's go back to the beginning of my presentation real quick. Without having the individual, what you're actually going to miss out on is the purpose of doing this, which is to arrive at the thought process. So if you're only looking at text, you're not looking at a thought process. You're looking at the presence or the absence of certain things in the text and the quantification of the tone of the text without relating it to where that tone might have come from, and what tone, what does the quantification of tone tell you about the building blocks that are shared across a group of people. See, this is a very different way of thinking, because if you're trained to do social media analysis the way it's been done now for the past 20 years, this is foreign territory. But unless you actually kind of basically try to figure out if this makes sense to you, you're not going to get to the thought process. So we have, and I regret to say this, but we have actually, we've gotten on a train, including myself, because I have done this myself before kind of thinking about it, right? We've gotten on a train of actually doing quantification in social media text that is not leading us to understanding the thought process. It's actually kind of taking us in a direction that will not converge with the thought process. So I'm bringing it back. And I'm saying, if there is a way to go back to the thought process, then this is the way you want to basically yank it. You have to yank it, bring it back. But it only works if you can identify, if you have an identifier that links across multiple texts written by the same individual, and obviously the fact that this is not a bot, that this is an actual person who's actually thinking, hopefully, or even if they're not thinking, they're reacting, but this is their reaction and not simply a retweet. This is why I eliminate all retweets. Yeah.
We have another question over here.
You gotta read my book. I'm serious. I think you're, the whole thing was written for that purpose, because I bumped into a lot of folks who were never trained with that mindset, with these areas that are usually disparate, that are very, very separate, and so I'm bringing them together in the book. And I'm doing it in a very, very, very basic way. So this is not a vanity book where actually I'm showing how important I am and what my research does. It's designed to actually simply communicate what I'm seeing as a solution for bringing back the research to the idea of the thought process, which I guess at some point in time it diverted from that. But if we don't, I mean, the whole point is to understand the thought process. Everything that we do, it revolves around that, and yet somehow we diverted from that. I'm not certain of when that happened. Right? Yeah, sorry.
Thank you so much for fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed it. One quick question. Look, if this is a social media model, maybe baseline or the known model is a legacy media model or traditional kind of a media model, right? But how do you think this is kind of, the specific to the social media when we think the barrier between social media and non-social media, whatever it is, outside of the social media, the barrier is kind of getting blurred and kind of blunted. For instance, like the background of this question, for our student generation, actually, social media is the major media. Because, these guys, like naturally have no kind of distinction or really big difference between where the media was from and where it's going. The social media is the one that they actually circulate all the information and express kind of, their responses onto that. For our generation, teachers, we work from the legacy media to the social media, but we do see actually, we do see the distinction between social and what's legacy, traditional, major, it's kind of really, mixed up, blunted, and getting looking at how this thing is actually just circulated or quantified in social media. Where do you think it's actually going in that kind of changes?
Well, I think both. You make a good point in the sense that there's a generational distinction between basically the older folks and the younger folks, and then how they're seeing things. But if there is one thing that they all have in common, which is that even those of us who actually existed before social media. I was telling my class that actually I did some of the work before even the World Wide Web was around, just to tell you, okay? I was looking at, so even then, we were looking at users. So we were looking at the user's mindset. We were looking at the user's thought process. Even before the web, and after the web, obviously, the users essentially is what ties us all together. The users meaning, in this particular case, the technology user, the social media user, the communicator, the person who actually, the target audience, the product user, the brand user, all these are under the umbrella of the user. So if you take the user as the thing that ties us all together, then whether it be social media or legacy media, it doesn't matter. Because we're all focused on understanding the user, whether it be a consumer of goods or services or brands or whatever. I hope that answers. Yeah, it's all about the user. It's all about the user. And in my case, It's not only about the user, but it's about the user's thought process, and not the individual user's thought process, but the shared thought process among users. Because an individual might have idiosyncrasies, but there are enough common building blocks across users that we can actually then, ideally, get to the point of building networks of knowledge regarding how these building blocks are interrelated. And by observing how these building blocks are interrelated, we're seeing inside their heads. As a group, not individually. We're seeing inside their heads. And we can make decisions based on that.
So we do have a couple more questions, however, it is 4:30. So I'm going to invite any of you who have additional questions to please come up here and have a chat with Dr. Elasmar. But for the rest of you, thank you for joining us. Let's give a final hand for Dr. Elasmar.